She collapsed onto the frozen barn floor in the middle of a blizzard, her pregnant body seizing with contractions as her strength gave out and death closed in. When 6 house cats surrounded her instead of fleeing, what they did over the next 72 hours would stun wildlife experts and make headlines around the world. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The wind howled across the frozen landscape of rural Vermont like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of the worst blizzard the region had seen in decades. Temperatures had plummeted to 15 degrees below zero, and the snow fell in thick, relentless curtains that obscured everything beyond a few feet. In the heart of this frozen wilderness, a pregnant bobcat named Sierra fought against time and nature itself, her swollen belly heavy with lives that demanded to be born. She had been searching for shelter for 3 days, driven from her usual territory by a forest fire that had swept through the mountains the previous autumn, destroying everything she had ever known. Now, with her body racked by the first contractions of labor, she stumbled through the darkness toward a faint yellow glow in the distance. The old Patterson barn had stood on that hillside for over 100 years, its weathered wooden walls bearing testament to countless storms and seasons. Margaret Patterson, a 72-year-old widow who had lived on the property her entire life, kept the barn heated with old space heaters during the coldest months, not for livestock she no longer owned, but for the colony of barn cats that had become her unexpected family. There were 6 of them in total, each one a rescue that had found its way to her door over the years. Shadow, a sleek black tom with knowing golden eyes, had been the first, appearing on her porch during a thunderstorm 8 years ago. Then came Marmalade, a big orange tabby with a gentle disposition, followed by Smokey, a dark gray cat with a mysterious past. Luna, a pure white female with mismatched eyes, had arrived next, along with Patches, an orange and white cat with a crooked tail. The newest addition was Oliver, a dignified gray cat who had simply walked into the barn one day and never left. Margaret had noticed her cats behaving strangely all afternoon. Shadow kept pacing near the barn door, his ears swiveling toward sounds that human ears could not detect. Marmalade, usually the most relaxed of the group, sat rigid and alert near the large barn doors, his amber eyes fixed on something in the swirling snow. At first, Margaret dismissed their behavior as typical feline sensitivity to the approaching storm, but as evening fell and the blizzard's fury intensified, she began to wonder if something else had captured their attention. She had lived alongside animals long enough to know that they sensed things beyond human perception, and tonight, every instinct told her that her cats were trying to communicate something important. Sierra reached the barn just as another powerful contraction seized her body. The wildcat was exhausted, her normally pristine spotted coat matted with ice and snow, her breathing labored from the exertion of her desperate journey. At 3 years old, this was her first pregnancy, and instinct told her that something was wrong. The contractions had started too early, brought on perhaps by the stress of her displacement or the brutal cold that had sapped her strength. She needed warmth and safety, and through the crack in the barn's old wooden doors she could see golden hay and feel the whisper of heat escaping into the frozen night. With the last of her strength, she pushed through the gap and collapsed onto the straw-covered floor, her sides heaving as she prepared to bring new life into a world that had shown her nothing but hardship. The barn cats froze as the wild creature entered their sanctuary. Shadow's fur bristled instinctively at the sight of the bobcat, a predator nearly twice his size with powerful jaws and claws that could end any of their lives in an instant. Marmalade let out a low growl, positioning himself between the intruder and the others. Luna and Patches retreated to the safety of the hayloft, their eyes wide with fear. Oliver stood his ground near the space heater, his gray fur puffed up in alarm. For a long moment, the barn was filled with tension as domestic and wild faced each other across the straw-covered floor. But then something remarkable happened. Shadow, the oldest and wisest of the barn cats, began to approach the fallen bobcat. His movements were slow and deliberate, his body low to the ground in a posture of submission rather than aggression. The other cats watched in astonishment as their leader drew closer to the wild creature, his golden eyes taking in details that the others had missed. The bobcat was not here to hunt. She was here to give birth. Her swollen belly, the rhythm of her breathing, the fear and exhaustion in her eyes all told a story that transcended the boundaries between wild and domestic. Margaret had been watching from the door that connected the barn to her farmhouse, her hand pressed against her chest in disbelief. In all her years living alongside animals, she had never witnessed anything quite like what was unfolding before her. The temperature outside had dropped to 20 below zero, and through the barn's frost-covered windows she could see nothing but white. The radio had warned that the blizzard would last at least 2 more days, making travel impossible and trapping everyone and everything in place. Whatever was going to happen in this barn would happen without outside intervention. Sierra lifted her head weakly as the black cat approached, her yellow eyes meeting his golden ones in a moment of understanding that seemed to defy everything known about predator and prey, wild and tame. She was too weak to fight, too exhausted to flee, and too desperate to refuse whatever help might come her way. When Shadow settled down a few feet away from her, his body language calm and unthreatening, something shifted in the cold barn air. Marmalade was the next to approach, his earlier aggression replaced by curiosity and something that looked almost like concern. One by one, the barn cats began to form a loose circle around the laboring bobcat, their combined body heat creating a small pocket of warmth in the freezing barn. As the first kitten began to emerge into the world, Sierra let out a cry that echoed through the wooden rafters, and outside, the blizzard raged on as if determined to test the limits of survival itself. What happened next would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about animal behavior and prove that compassion knows no species boundaries. The first kitten emerged into the world at precisely 11:47 that night, a tiny bundle of spotted fur no larger than Margaret's fist. Sierra, exhausted from hours of labor, immediately began cleaning the newborn with her rough tongue, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. The barn cats watched in fascinated silence, their earlier fear replaced by something closer to reverence. Shadow had not moved from his position a few feet away, his golden eyes reflecting the warm glow of the space heater as he observed the miracle unfolding before him. Marmalade had settled into the hay nearby, his large orange body creating a barrier between the birthing mother and the cold draft that seeped through the barn's old walls. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, her weathered hands gripping the wooden frame as she watched the scene with tears streaming down her cheeks. In 72 years of life, she had witnessed countless births on this farm. Calves, lambs, kittens, and puppies had all taken their first breaths under her careful watch. But never had she seen anything like this. A wild predator, one of the most elusive creatures in the Vermont wilderness, was giving birth in her barn, while her domestic cats formed a protective circle around her. It defied logic. It defied nature. And yet, it was happening right before her eyes. The second kitten came 30 minutes later, and this time Sierra was too weak to clean it herself. The tiny creature lay motionless on the hay, its wet fur glistening in the dim light, and for a terrible moment, Margaret thought it had been born dead. But then Shadow did something that would later make international headlines when the story finally broke. The old black Tom rose from his position and approached the newborn kitten, his movements gentle and deliberate. He began to lick the tiny bobcat, cleaning away the birth membrane with the same careful attention a mother cat would give her own offspring. Sierra watched with exhausted eyes, making no move to stop him, as if she understood that this strange domestic cat was trying to help. The kitten began to move, its tiny legs paddling weakly as Shadow's ministrations stimulated its breathing. A small cry emerged from its spotted body, and Margaret let out a sob of relief that echoed through the cold barn. She wanted desperately to help, to intervene in some way, but her years of experience told her that any human involvement right now could spook the wild mother and endanger everyone. So she watched, and she prayed, and she bore witness to something that would change her understanding of the animal kingdom forever. By 2 a.m, Sierra had given birth to 4 kittens in total. 3 of them were healthy and nursing, their tiny bodies pressed against their mother's belly as they sought warmth and nourishment. But the 4th kitten, the smallest of the litter, was struggling. It had been born last, and something was clearly wrong. The tiny creature could not find its way to its mother's milk, and its cries grew weaker with each passing minute. Sierra tried to nudge it toward her belly, but her exhaustion made her movements clumsy and ineffective. The temperature in the barn had dropped despite the space heaters, and the smallest kitten was losing the battle against the cold. Luna, the white cat with mismatched eyes, had been watching from a safe distance throughout the night. She was the most timid of Margaret's barn cats, usually the first to flee at any sign of danger. But as she watched the smallest kitten struggling to survive, something stirred within her. Luna had never had kittens of her own. She had been spayed as a young cat, long before her maternal instincts could ever be fulfilled. But those instincts were there, buried deep within her feline DNA, and tonight they rose to the surface with unexpected force. The white cat descended from her perch in the hayloft and approached the struggling kitten with careful, measured steps. Sierra's head lifted slightly, her yellow eyes tracking Luna's movement, but she made no aggressive gesture. Perhaps she was too exhausted. Perhaps she sensed Luna's intentions. Or perhaps, in that frozen barn on that impossible night, the boundaries between species had simply ceased to exist. Luna lay down beside the smallest kitten and began to groom it, her warm body providing the heat that the tiny creature desperately needed. She nudged it gently toward Sierra's belly, guiding it with a patience that seemed almost supernatural. Margaret watched as the smallest kitten finally latched onto its mother, its tiny mouth finding nourishment at last. The old woman sank to her knees in the doorway, overwhelmed by what she had witnessed. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, the wind howling around the barn like a chorus of angry spirits. But inside, in that small pocket of warmth and hay, something beautiful had taken root. 6 domestic cats and 1 wild bobcat had formed an unlikely alliance, united by the universal imperative to protect new life. As dawn approached, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, the barn had transformed into something resembling a nursery. Sierra lay on her side in a nest of golden hay, her 4 kittens nursing contentedly against her spotted belly. The barn cats had arranged themselves in a semicircle around her, their bodies forming a living wall of warmth and protection. Shadow sat closest to her head, his black fur almost touching her spotted coat. Marmalade and Smoky flanked her sides, their combined mass blocking the drafts that crept through the old wooden walls. Luna remained near the kittens, her white fur a stark contrast to their spotted coats. Patches and Oliver completed the circle, their eyes alert for any sign of danger. Margaret finally allowed herself to move from the doorway. She walked slowly to the corner of the barn where she kept emergency supplies and retrieved a bowl, filling it with fresh water from the pump. She set it down a few feet from Sierra, close enough for the exhausted mother to drink without having to move far from her kittens. The bobcat watched her with wary eyes but made no aggressive move. When Margaret retreated to a safe distance, Sierra stretched her neck and drank deeply, her thirst finally overwhelming her caution. The old woman knew she needed to call someone, a wildlife expert, a veterinarian, someone who could assess the situation and ensure that these wild kittens had the best chance of survival. But the blizzard had knocked out the phone lines, and the roads were impassable. For now, she and her remarkable cats were the only help that Sierra and her newborns had. And somehow, Margaret thought as she watched the extraordinary scene before her. That might just be enough. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, trapping Margaret and her extraordinary guests in a world of white silence. During that time, she witnessed behaviors that would have seemed impossible to her just a week before. The barn cats had fully accepted Sierra and her kittens into their colony, treating the wild family as if they had always belonged. Shadow had become something of a guardian, positioning himself near the barn door whenever he sensed movement outside, his black fur bristling with protective instinct. Marmalade spent hours lying beside Sierra, his rumbling purr seeming to calm the wild mother in ways that defied explanation. And Luna had become an unofficial nursemaid, helping to keep the kittens warm when Sierra needed to eat or drink. Margaret documented everything she could in a worn leather journal that had belonged to her late husband. She sketched the arrangement of the cats around Sierra, noted the times when each kitten nursed, and recorded the small interactions that revealed the depth of the bond forming between wild and domestic. She knew that what she was witnessing was scientifically significant, perhaps even unprecedented. But more than that, she knew it was beautiful in a way that transcended academic importance. In a world that often seemed defined by conflict and division, these animals had found common ground in the most primal of circumstances. On the 2nd day after the birth, Sierra finally allowed Margaret to approach close enough to examine the kittens. The old woman moved slowly, speaking in a soft, soothing voice that she had perfected over decades of working with animals. Shadow accompanied her, his presence seeming to reassure the wild mother that this human could be trusted. Margaret knelt in the hay about 2 feet from Sierra, her arthritic knees protesting the cold floor, and studied the 4 tiny kittens with practiced eyes. 3 of them appeared healthy and strong, their spotted coats already showing the distinctive markings of their species. But the 4th kitten, the one that Luna had helped save on that first desperate night, was noticeably smaller than its siblings. The runt of the litter, Margaret thought with concern. In the wild, such a kitten would face tremendous odds against survival. Competition for milk, vulnerability to predators, and the harsh realities of nature all worked against the smallest members of any litter. But here in this warm barn surrounded by unlikely protectors, perhaps this little one had a chance. Margaret watched as Luna groomed the small kitten with patient attention, her white paws gently holding it in place as her tongue worked through its spotted fur. The kitten mewed softly, a sound that was answered immediately by Sierra, who nuzzled her smallest offspring with visible tenderness. By the 3rd day, the blizzard had begun to weaken, and Margaret knew that the outside world would soon intrude upon their isolated sanctuary. She had decisions to make, difficult ones that weighed heavily on her mind as she sat in her rocking chair by the farmhouse window, watching the snow slowly stop falling. Sierra was a wild animal, a bobcat who belonged in the forests and mountains of Vermont. Her kittens would need to learn the skills of survival in the wild, skills that could only be taught by their mother in their natural habitat. The barn cats had provided crucial support during a crisis, but they could not teach young bobcats how to hunt, or avoid predators, or navigate the complex social dynamics of wild feline life. But there was another consideration, one that troubled Margaret deeply. Sierra had been displaced from her territory by the fire. Where would she go when she left the barn? The forests she had known were gone, burned to ash and skeletal trees that would take decades to recover. Other bobcats would have claimed the remaining suitable habitat, and a mother with 4 young kittens would be vulnerable to territorial disputes and aggression. The world outside the barn's weathered walls was not the world Sierra had known before, and Margaret feared for what awaited her wild guest. On the 4th morning, Margaret woke to find the sun shining for the first time in nearly a week. The snow lay deep and glittering across the landscape, transforming her farm into a winter wonderland that sparkled beneath the clear blue sky. She made her way to the barn with a bucket of fresh water and a plate of raw chicken that she had been saving in her refrigerator for just this purpose. Sierra needed to regain her strength, and Margaret had been supplementing her diet with protein-rich offerings that the wild mother accepted with increasing trust. What she found in the barn stopped her in her tracks. Sierra was standing for the first time since giving birth, her powerful legs steady beneath her as she stretched muscles that had been still for too long. The 4 kittens lay nestled in a pile of hay, watched over by Luna and Patches while their mother tested her body. But it was the arrangement of the other cats that captured Margaret's attention. Shadow, Marmalade, Smokey, and Oliver had positioned themselves in a perfect semicircle facing the barn doors, their bodies tense and alert. Something outside had captured their attention, and their protective formation suggested that they perceived it as a threat. Margaret set down her offerings and moved quietly to the frost-covered window. Through the ice crystals, she could see movement near the tree line at the edge of her property. Her aging eyes squinted against the glare of sunlight on snow, and gradually the shapes resolved into recognizable forms. There were 3 of them, large canine figures with thick fur and intelligent eyes that scanned the farm with predatory interest. Coyotes. The blizzard had driven them down from the higher elevations, and now they were searching for easy prey in the aftermath of the storm. Margaret's heart began to race as she assessed the situation. Coyotes were opportunistic hunters, and while they typically avoided adult bobcats, a weakened mother with young kittens would present a tempting target. The barn doors were old and weathered, secured by a simple wooden latch that might not withstand a determined assault. Her cats, for all their courage and loyalty, were no match for 3 hungry coyotes, and Sierra, though standing, was still recovering from the trauma of birth and days of deprivation. The old woman reached for the shotgun that hung above the barn door, a weapon she had not fired in over a decade. Her hands trembled as she checked the chamber, and she prayed that she would not need to use it. But as she watched the coyotes begin their slow approach toward the barn, Margaret knew that the fight for survival was far from over. The coyotes moved with the patient confidence of predators who had learned that winter storms often left easy meals in their wake. The largest of the 3, a grizzled male with a torn ear and scars across his muzzle, led the approach toward the barn. His companions flanked him on either side, their movements coordinated by years of hunting together as a pack. They had caught the scent of blood on the wind, the unmistakable signature of recent birth, and their hunger drove them forward despite the unfamiliar territory. Inside the barn, Sierra had lowered herself back into the hay beside her kittens, but her body was tense with awareness. Her ears swiveled toward the sounds outside, and a low growl rumbled in her throat. The barn cats maintained their protective formation, their fur bristled and their tails puffed to twice their normal size. Shadow stood at the center of the line, his golden eyes fixed on the barn doors with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. He had never faced a coyote before, had never been tested by a predator larger and more dangerous than himself. But something primal had awakened within him, a fierce determination to protect the lives that had been entrusted to his care. Margaret positioned herself near the barn doors, the shotgun heavy and unfamiliar in her weathered hands. She had grown up on this farm, had learned to shoot from her father when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle. But that had been decades ago, and the arthritis that plagued her joints made her wonder if she could still aim true. She prayed she would not have to find out. Through the gap between the doors, she could see the coyotes drawing closer, their paws leaving deep prints in the pristine snow. The lead coyote stopped about 30 feet from the barn, his nose working the air as he assessed the situation. He could smell the bobcat and her kittens, could sense the vulnerability of new life. But there were other scents too, confusing ones that did not fit the simple equation of predator and prey. Domestic cats, at least 6 of them, and the overwhelming presence of human. The coyote was old enough to have learned caution around humans, had seen what their loud sticks could do to his kind. He hesitated, weighing his hunger against his hard-won wisdom. Margaret saw her opportunity in that moment of hesitation. She pushed open the barn door just enough to step outside, raising the shotgun to her shoulder with hands that trembled but did not waver. Her voice rang out across the frozen landscape, strong and commanding despite her 72 years. "Get out of here," she shouted. "Go on, get. This is not your place." The coyotes startled at her sudden appearance, their bodies tensing for flight. But the lead male held his ground, his yellow eyes meeting hers with a calculating stare that sent chills down her spine. Inside the barn, Shadow made a decision that would later be analyzed by animal behaviorists around the world. The black cat slipped through the gap in the barn doors and positioned himself beside Margaret, his small body dwarfed by the coyotes, but his stance radiating defiance. Marmalade followed seconds later, then Smokey, then Oliver. One by one, the barn cats emerged into the winter sunlight and arranged themselves in a line beside the old woman, their combined presence creating an illusion of numbers that gave the coyotes pause. Luna and Patches remained inside with Sierra and the kittens, their bodies pressed close to the wild family in a final line of defense. The white cat's mismatched eyes were wide with fear, but she did not abandon her post. She had helped save the smallest kitten on the night of its birth, had formed a bond with these wild creatures that transcended the boundaries of species. If the coyotes made it past the others, they would have to go through her. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, though in reality it was probably no more than 2 or 3 minutes. Margaret kept the shotgun raised, her arms aching with the effort, her eyes locked on the lead coyote. The barn cats stood their ground beside her, a ragtag army of domestic felines facing down predators 3 times their size, and in that frozen moment, something shifted in the balance of power. The lead coyote broke first. Perhaps it was the gun, or the unified front of cats and human. Perhaps it was some deeper instinct that recognized the futility of this particular hunt. He turned away from the barn and began to trot back toward the tree line, his companions falling into step behind him. Margaret watched them go, not lowering the shotgun until they had disappeared into the forest shadows. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, her body sagging with relief as the adrenaline began to fade. The barn cats remained outside for several minutes, their eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of the coyote's return. Shadow walked a slow perimeter around the barn entrance, his nose working the air, marking the boundaries of territory that he had claimed as his own. Marmalade and Smokey followed his lead, their movements mimicking his with an almost military precision. Oliver stood guard near the doors, his gray fur ruffled by the cold wind, but his posture unwavering. When Margaret finally ushered them all back inside, she found Sierra watching her with an expression that seemed almost grateful. The wild bobcat's yellow eyes held none of the wariness that had marked their earlier interactions. Instead, there was something that looked remarkably like trust, a recognition that this human had risked herself to protect Sierra's offspring. The 4 kittens nursed contentedly, oblivious to the danger that had just passed, their small bodies warm and safe in the hay. Margaret sank down onto a bale of hay, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The shotgun lay across her lap, its weight a reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Shadow approached and pressed his head against her hand, his purr rumbling through her trembling fingers. "We did it," she whispered to him, her voice cracking with emotion. "We actually did it." The black cat blinked slowly, his golden eyes reflecting the morning light that streamed through the barn windows. Outside, the winter sun continued to shine on a world that had no idea what had just transpired in an old barn on a Vermont hillside. The day after the coyote encounter, the snowplows finally reached the rural roads that connected Margaret's farm to the outside world. She heard them in the distance, the grinding rumble of heavy machinery cutting through the frozen silence that had enveloped her property for nearly a week. By noon, her driveway was accessible, and by evening, the phone lines had been restored. Margaret sat in her kitchen for a long time, staring at the old rotary phone on the wall, wrestling with a decision that felt impossibly heavy. She knew she needed to call someone. The Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department would want to know about Sierra and her kittens. There were protocols for situations like this, regulations designed to protect both wild animals and the humans who encountered them. A bobcat in a barn was not something that could remain a secret forever, and the longer Margaret delayed, the more complicated the situation would become. But as she thought about the scene in the barn, about Shadow and Luna and the others standing guard over their wild guests, she feared what intervention might mean. Her hand was on the receiver when headlights swept across her kitchen window. Margaret peered through the frost and saw a familiar pickup truck making its way up her freshly plowed driveway. It was her neighbor, Tom Hendricks, a retired state trooper who lived on the next property over. He had probably seen the lights in her farmhouse and come to check on her after the storm. Margaret felt a mix of relief and anxiety as she watched him park and climb out of his truck. Tom was a good man, a widower like herself, who had become something of a friend over the years. They shared coffee on Sunday mornings when the weather allowed, and he helped her with repairs that had become too difficult for her aging body to manage alone. But Tom was also practical, and by the book, a man who had spent his career enforcing rules and regulations. Margaret was not sure how he would react to what she had been harboring in her barn. She met him at the door before he could knock, ushering him into the warmth of her kitchen with the practiced hospitality of a lifelong Vermonter. Tom stomped the snow from his boots and accepted the cup of coffee she pressed into his hands, his weathered face creased with concern. "Worried about you, Margaret," he said, settling into a chair at her kitchen table. "Storm like that, woman your age alone out here." His words were gruff, but his eyes were kind. Margaret sat across from him and wrapped her hands around her own cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic. "Tom," she said slowly, "I need to tell you something. Something happened during the storm, and I am not sure what to do about it." She watched his expression shift from concern to curiosity, and then she told him everything. The pregnant bobcat stumbling into her barn, the barn cats forming their protective circle, the birth, the coyotes, the impossible alliance that had formed between wild and domestic. Tom listened without interrupting, his coffee growing cold in his hands as Margaret's story unfolded. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, his law enforcement training clearly wrestling with what he had heard. "A bobcat," he finally said, "in your barn, with your cats." Margaret nodded, bracing herself for the lecture about wildlife regulations and proper authorities. But Tom surprised her. He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. "I want to see it," he said. They walked to the barn together, their boots crunching through the snow that still lay thick across the farmyard. Margaret could feel her heart pounding as she reached for the barn door, suddenly terrified that what awaited inside would not match her description. But when she pulled the door open and the late afternoon light spilled across the hay-covered floor, Tom Hendricks let out a sound that was half gasp and half prayer. The scene was exactly as Margaret had described, perhaps even more remarkable in person. Sierra lay on her side in a nest of golden hay, her 4 kittens nursing contentedly against her spotted belly. The barn cats were arranged around her in their protective semicircle, exactly as they had been for days. Shadow sat nearest to the bobcat's head, his black fur almost touching her spotted coat. Marmalade and Smoky flanked her sides. Luna lay near the kittens, her white fur a stark contrast to their wild markings. Patches and Oliver completed the formation, their eyes turning toward the humans with calm acknowledgement. Tom stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth slightly open as he tried to process what his eyes were telling him. In 40 years of living in Vermont, he had seen exactly 2 bobcats in the wild, and both had been fleeting glimpses of spotted fur disappearing into the forest. To see one lying peacefully in a barn, surrounded by domestic cats who treated her like family, was something his practical mind could barely accept. "How long has this been going on?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since the first night of the storm," Margaret replied. "She came in to give birth. My cats, they just accepted her. I have never seen anything like it." Tom shook his head slowly, his eyes still fixed on the extraordinary tableau before him. "Nobody would believe this," he said. "If you had not shown me, I would not have believed it myself." They stood together in the doorway for a long time, watching as the barn cats went about their self-appointed duties. Shadow rose and walked a slow circuit around Sierra and the kittens, checking for threats before settling back into his position. Luna groomed the smallest kitten with patient attention, her tongue working through its spotted fur with maternal care. Marmalade's rumbling purr filled the barn with a sound that seemed to calm everyone, human and feline alike. When they finally returned to the farmhouse, Tom helped Margaret make the call to the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. He stayed beside her as she explained the situation to a skeptical dispatcher, his presence lending credibility to a story that sounded like fantasy. By the time she hung up the phone, arrangements had been made for a wildlife biologist to visit the following morning. Whatever happened next, Margaret knew she had done the right thing. The world needed to know about this miracle in her barn. Dr. Elena Vasquez arrived at the Patterson farm just after 9 the following morning, her state-issued SUV navigating the narrow country road with careful precision. At 43, Elena had spent nearly 2 decades working as a wildlife biologist for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and she thought she had seen everything the natural world had to offer. Orphaned bear cubs raised by humans, deer that had imprinted on family dogs, even a moose that had wandered into a suburban swimming pool. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the phone call she had received the previous evening. She had listened to the dispatcher's report with growing skepticism, certain that the elderly woman on the isolated farm had somehow misidentified the animal in her barn. Perhaps it was a large feral cat, or a Maine Coon with unusual markings. The idea that a wild bobcat would seek shelter in a barn filled with domestic cats, give birth there, and then be protected by those same cats seemed like the plot of a children's movie rather than a legitimate wildlife incident. But protocol required investigation, and so Elena had made the long drive out to the Patterson property with low expectations. Margaret met her at the door with fresh coffee and a calm demeanor that immediately impressed the biologist. This was not a woman prone to exaggeration or fantasy. Her eyes were clear and intelligent, her handshake firm despite the arthritis that visibly affected her knuckles. She introduced Tom Hendricks, who had returned that morning to provide support, and Elena noted the former trooper's serious expression. Whatever was in that barn had clearly affected him as well. They walked to the barn together, Margaret leading the way with the careful steps of someone who had traversed this path thousands of times. Elena carried her field kit, a leather bag containing everything she might need to assess and document a wildlife encounter. Camera, specimen containers, measuring tape, tranquilizer supplies. She hoped she would not need the last item. Sedating a nursing mother was always risky, and if there really were kittens involved, any intervention could have devastating consequences. The smell hit her first when Margaret opened the barn door. The unmistakable musk of wild feline mixed with the softer scents of hay and domestic cat. Elena's trained nose recognized the difference immediately, and her skepticism began to crumble. Then she saw them, and everything she thought she knew about animal behavior shifted on its axis. The bobcat was larger than Elena had expected, a healthy female despite the visible signs of recent hardship. Her spotted coat gleamed in the morning light that filtered through the barn's high windows, and her yellow eyes tracked the newcomer with wary intelligence. 4 kittens nursed at her belly, their small bodies already showing the distinctive markings of their species. But it was the domestic cats that captured Elena's attention, and held it with magnetic force. They were arranged around the bobcat in a formation that looked almost ceremonial, their bodies positioned to provide maximum warmth and protection. A black cat sat nearest the wild mother's head, his golden eyes meeting Elena's with an expression that seemed to communicate both warning and welcome. An orange tabby lay pressed against her flank, his purr audible even from across the barn. A white cat with mismatched eyes rested near the kittens, her posture protective and maternal. 3 other cats completed the circle, their varied colors creating a patchwork of domestic devotion around their wild guest. Elena stood motionless in the doorway, her scientific mind racing to process what she was seeing. She had studied animal behavior for 20 years, had published papers on interspecies relationships and the boundaries between wild and domestic. Everything she knew told her that this scene was impossible. Bobcats were solitary predators who viewed smaller animals as prey, not companions. Domestic cats were territorial creatures who typically responded to unfamiliar felines with aggression, not acceptance. And yet the evidence before her eyes told a different story entirely. She raised her camera slowly, not wanting to startle the animals, and began to document the scene. The shutter clicked softly as she captured image after image, knowing that her colleagues would be as skeptical as she had been without photographic proof. She noted the arrangement of the cats, the condition of the bobcat and her kittens, the evidence of the nest that had been constructed in the hay. Every detail would be important when she wrote her report. Margaret watched the biologist work, her weathered face calm, but her eyes revealing the anxiety beneath. She had grown to love these animals, wild and domestic alike, and she feared what official intervention might mean for them. The thought of Sierra being captured and relocated, of the kittens being taken to some sterile facility, made her heart ache with preemptive grief. Whatever happened, she wanted what was best for them. She just was not sure anymore what that meant. Elena finally lowered her camera and turned to face Margaret and Tom, her expression a mixture of wonder and professional composure. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice slightly unsteady, "I have been doing this job for almost 20 years. I have a doctorate in wildlife biology and have studied animal behavior on 3 continents. And I can tell you with complete honesty that I have never seen anything like this." Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders at the validation in the biologist's words. "So you believe me," she said. It was not quite a question. Elena nodded slowly, her eyes drifting back to the extraordinary scene in the barn. "I believe what I can see with my own eyes. The how and why of it, that is going to take some time to understand." She paused, her scientific curiosity clearly at war with her professional obligations. "I need to make some calls, consult with my supervisors. A situation like this requires careful consideration." The 3 humans retreated to the farmhouse, leaving the barn cats to continue their vigil over Sierra and her kittens. As Elena pulled out her phone and began the process of reporting her findings, Margaret stood at the kitchen window and watched the barn with worried eyes. The world was about to discover her secret, and she could only pray that its response would be as compassionate as the cats who had started it all. The news spread faster than anyone had anticipated. Elena's report to her supervisors had triggered a chain of communication that reached the state capitol by nightfall, and by the following morning, the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department was fielding calls from media outlets across the country. Someone had leaked the story, complete with one of Elena's photographs, and the image of a wild bobcat surrounded by protective domestic cats had captured the public imagination with viral intensity. Margaret's quiet farm became a destination overnight. News vans lined the country road, their satellite dishes pointed toward the gray winter sky like mechanical flowers seeking electronic sunlight. Reporters trampled through the snow, cameras ready, hoping for a glimpse of the animals that had become an overnight sensation. Margaret, overwhelmed by the attention, had retreated to her farmhouse and drawn the curtains, refusing all requests for interviews. Tom Hendricks appointed himself her unofficial guardian, his former law enforcement presence proving invaluable in keeping the most aggressive journalists at bay. Elena found herself thrust into the role of spokesperson, a position she had never sought and did not particularly enjoy. She stood before the cameras and explained what she had witnessed in scientific terms, careful to temper the public's romantic interpretation with biological reality. "These animals are not friends in the way humans understand friendship," she said during one particularly crowded press conference. "What we are observing appears to be a complex behavioral response to extraordinary circumstances. The domestic cats may have recognized the bobcat's vulnerability and responded with protective instincts that are normally reserved for their own species." But even as she spoke these measured words, Elena knew they did not capture the full truth of what was happening in that barn. She had returned multiple times over the past 3 days, documenting the interactions between Sierra and the barn cats with growing amazement. The behaviors she observed went far beyond simple instinct. Shadow groomed Sierra's ears with tender attention. Luna continued to help care for the kittens as if they were her own. Marmalade's constant purring seemed to have a genuinely calming effect on the wild mother, whose initial wariness had given way to something that looked remarkably like contentment. The scientific community was divided in its response. Some researchers dismissed the phenomenon as anthropomorphization, the human tendency to project emotional meaning onto animal behavior. Others saw it as evidence of cognitive abilities in domestic cats that had been previously underestimated. A prominent animal behaviorist from Cornell University requested permission to study the situation, and Elena found herself coordinating a growing team of experts who descended on the Patterson farm with notebooks and recording equipment. Through it all, Margaret worried about Sierra and the kittens. The constant human presence, the noise and disruption of the media circus, all of it seemed antithetical to the peaceful environment that a nursing mother needed. She voiced her concerns to Elena during one of the biologist's visits, her weathered face lined with anxiety. "This cannot be good for them," she said, gesturing toward the window where another news van was visible in the distance. "All this attention, all these strangers. She came here for safety, and now look what we have done." Elena understood the old woman's concerns and shared many of them. She had argued strongly for limiting access to the barn, and had finally prevailed in establishing a strict protocol that allowed only essential personnel inside. The media was kept at the road, their telephoto lenses capturing only distant glimpses of the weathered structure that had become the most famous barn in America. But she also recognized that public interest had its benefits. Donations were pouring into wildlife conservation organizations. Schools were using the story to teach children about animal behavior and compassion. Something beautiful was emerging from the chaos. Inside the barn, largely oblivious to the turmoil outside, Sierra and her kittens continued to thrive. The smallest kitten, the one that Luna had helped save on the first night, had grown stronger with each passing day. Elena had begun calling her Hope, a name that seemed to fit both the kitten and the larger story unfolding around her. The other 3 kittens were healthy and active, their eyes now open and their personalities beginning to emerge. They tumbled over each other in the hay, their play supervised by an unlikely committee of domestic cats who seemed to take their responsibilities with utmost seriousness. 2 weeks after the story broke, a decision had to be made about Sierra's future. Elena convened a meeting at the Patterson farmhouse, gathering the key stakeholders around Margaret's kitchen table. Representatives from the Fish and Wildlife Department, the Cornell research team, a wildlife rehabilitation specialist, and of course, Margaret herself. Tom Hendricks sat in the corner, his presence a comfort to the elderly woman who had become the reluctant center of this extraordinary situation. The discussion was lengthy and sometimes contentious. Some argued that Sierra should be relocated to a wildlife sanctuary where she and her kittens could be monitored and eventually released into protected habitat. Others suggested that the unique circumstances warranted a different approach, that separating Sierra from the barn cats who had become her surrogate family might cause psychological harm. The rehabilitation specialist pointed out that the kittens would need to learn wild skills if they were ever to survive on their own, skills that domestic cats could not teach them. Margaret listened to the debate with growing frustration. These experts spoke about Sierra and the kittens as if they were problems to be solved, variables in an equation that needed balancing. They did not see what she saw every day in that barn. The trust in Sierra's eyes when Margaret brought her food, the way Shadow positioned himself protectively whenever strangers approached, the bond between Luna and Little Hope that transcended every boundary science claimed existed between wild and domestic. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm, cutting through the professional discourse with the authority of someone who had earned her wisdom through decades of living close to the land. "You are all very smart people," she said, looking around the table at the assembled experts. "You have degrees and studies and theories about how animals should behave. But I have watched these creatures for weeks now. I have seen something that your textbooks say is impossible. Before you decide their fate, I think you owe it to them to understand what they have created together." The room fell silent, and Margaret knew that whatever came next, she had said what needed to be said. Margaret's words hung in the air like morning mist over the Vermont hills, settling into the consciousness of everyone present. Elena was the first to respond, her scientific skepticism softened by weeks of witnessing the impossible. "Mrs. Patterson is right," she said slowly, drawing surprised looks from her colleagues. "We have been so focused on protocols and precedents that we may have missed the most important variable in this equation. These animals have formed something unprecedented. Perhaps our response should be unprecedented as well." The discussion that followed took a different tone. Instead of debating what should be done to Sierra and her kittens, the group began exploring what could be done for them. The wildlife rehabilitation specialist, a weathered man named Frank Morrison, who had spent 40 years working with wild cats, suggested a compromise that gradually gained support around the table. "What if we approach this as a phased transition?" he proposed. "The mother needs to teach her kittens survival skills, but she also clearly benefits from the support system she has found here. Perhaps we can facilitate both." The plan that emerged was unlike anything the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department had ever attempted. Sierra and her kittens would remain at the Patterson farm for the immediate future, with the barn serving as a protected base of operations. As the kittens grew older and stronger, Frank would work with Elena to introduce wild skills training in the forests surrounding the property. The domestic cats would not be separated from their wild charges, but their access would be gradually reduced as the kittens developed the independence they would need to survive in the wild. Margaret agreed to the plan with visible relief, though she harbored private doubts about whether Sierra would cooperate with such structured intervention. The wild bobcat had shown remarkable adaptability in accepting the barn cats and tolerating human presence, but she remained fundamentally wild. Her instincts would eventually drive her back to the forests, and when that time came, Margaret knew she would have to let her go. Spring arrived slowly in Vermont that year, the snow retreating inch by inch as temperatures gradually climbed above freezing. The kittens grew with astonishing speed, their spotted coats thickening and their legs lengthening as they transformed from helpless newborns into curious explorers. Elena documented their development with meticulous attention, noting milestones that would contribute to scientific understanding of bobcat maturation, but she also found herself documenting something that defied scientific categorization: the ongoing relationship between the wild family and their domestic protectors. Shadow had become something of a mentor to the kittens, teaching them stalking techniques through patient demonstration. Elena watched in amazement as the old black cat crouched in the hay, his body low and his eyes fixed on an imaginary prey, while 4 spotted kittens mimicked his posture with varying degrees of success. It was behavior that made no evolutionary sense. Shadow was not their father, not even their species, and yet he invested hours in their education with dedication that rivaled any biological parent. Luna's bond with Hope, the smallest kitten, had only deepened as the weeks passed. The white cat and the spotted wild kitten were nearly inseparable, sleeping curled together and grooming each other with mutual affection. Frank Morrison observed this relationship with particular interest, noting that Hope seemed to be developing social skills that were unusual for her species. "Bobcats are solitary by nature," he told Elena during one of their observation sessions. "But this kitten is learning to value companionship. It will be interesting to see how that affects her behavior as an adult." The media attention had faded somewhat as newer stories captured public interest, but a dedicated following remained. A wildlife photographer named James Chen had negotiated exclusive access to document the story, and his images appeared regularly in nature magazines and online platforms. One photograph in particular captured the public imagination: Sierra lying in the hay with her 4 kittens, surrounded by the 6 domestic cats who had become her family. The image was shared millions of times, printed on calendars and postcards, and became an iconic representation of interspecies compassion. Margaret found unexpected purpose in her role as caretaker to this remarkable group. The loneliness that had marked her years since her husband's death receded as her farm became a center of activity and attention. Researchers came and went. Journalists occasionally requested updates, and a steady stream of letters arrived from people around the world who had been moved by the story. She answered each letter personally, her arthritic hands forming careful words of gratitude and reflection. Tom Hendricks became a fixture at the farm, his visits extending from occasional check-ins to daily presence. He helped Margaret manage the logistics of hosting researchers, repaired the barn's aging structure, and provided companionship that neither of them had realized they needed. Their Sunday morning coffees became daily rituals, their conversations ranging from the animals in the barn to memories of spouses lost and lives fully lived. Something was growing between them, as unexpected and natural as the bond between Sierra and the barn cats. By late April, the kittens had reached the age where wild training could begin in earnest. Frank Morrison arrived with equipment and expertise ready to guide the young bobcats toward the independence they would need to survive. Sierra watched these preparations with alert interest, her wild instincts clearly stirring as the forests around the farm came alive with spring. She began spending more time at the barn door, gazing out at the woods with an expression that Margaret recognized as longing. The first training session took place on a warm morning when the apple trees behind the barn were just beginning to bud. Frank had constructed a large outdoor enclosure that connected to the barn, allowing the kittens to experience the sights and sounds and smells of the wild while remaining protected. Sierra led her offspring into this new space with cautious excitement, her powerful body tense with awareness as she scanned for threats. The barn cats watched from inside, their expressions unreadable, but their attention unwavering. Margaret stood at the kitchen window with Tom beside her, watching as the wild family took their first steps toward the world they would eventually inhabit. Her heart was full of contradictory emotions: pride in what they had accomplished, grief for the separation she knew was coming, and underneath it all, a profound gratitude for having witnessed something that would stay with her for whatever years remained. The weeks that followed were marked by bittersweet progress. Sierra proved to be an exceptional mother, teaching her kittens the skills they would need to survive with an intensity that suggested she understood the stakes involved. She demonstrated hunting techniques using the live prey that Frank introduced to the enclosure, her powerful body a study in controlled violence as she showed her offspring how to stalk, pounce, and kill. The kittens learned quickly, their wild instincts awakening with each successful practice hunt. Helena documented every session, her notebooks filling with observations that would eventually form the basis of a groundbreaking paper on bobcat maternal behavior. But she also noted something that troubled her scientific sensibilities. The kittens continued to seek out the barn cats between training sessions, particularly Hope, who remained devoted to Luna despite her growing wildness. This attachment was not part of the plan. Wild animals needed to fear or at least avoid domestic creatures if they were to survive in a world where cats often meant farms, and farms meant humans with guns. Frank shared Elena's concern, though he expressed it differently. "These kittens are caught between two worlds," he told Margaret during one of their conversations in the farmhouse kitchen. "Their mother is teaching them to be wild, but their first weeks of life taught them that domestic cats are family. When we release them, that confusion could be dangerous." Margaret nodded, understanding the implication but finding herself unable to accept it. She had watched these animals create something beautiful together. The thought of that beauty becoming a liability filled her with sorrow. The barn cat seemed to sense that changes were coming. Shadow spent more time than ever near Sierra, his black body pressed against her spotted flank during the quiet evening hours. Marmalade's purring took on an almost mournful quality, as if he were saying goodbye with every rumbling breath. Luna clung to Hope with desperate affection, grooming the young bobcat obsessively and following her to the edge of the enclosure whenever she ventured outside. Even Oliver and Patches and Smokey, who had maintained more distance from the wild family, now sought proximity, as if trying to memorize their presence. June arrived with warm breezes and long days that stretched toward 10 o'clock darkness. The kittens were nearly 4 months old now, approaching the age when wild bobcats would begin ranging away from their mothers. Sierra had become increasingly restless, her wild nature asserting itself with growing urgency. She paced the enclosure at night, her yellow eyes fixed on the forest that called to her with ancient voices. Margaret watched her through the barn window and knew that the time for release was approaching. The decision was made during a meeting that felt more like a funeral planning session than a wildlife conference. Elena presented data showing that the kittens had developed strong hunting skills and appropriate fear responses to potential threats. Frank confirmed that Sierra was physically ready for release, her body having fully recovered from the hardships of the previous winter. The Cornell researchers added their assessment that the scientific documentation was complete and that prolonging captivity would serve no research purpose. Everyone agreed that release should occur within the week. Margaret accepted the verdict with quiet dignity, though her heart felt like it was breaking. She had known this day would come from the very beginning, had understood that Sierra and her kittens belonged to the wild and not to her, but knowing and accepting were different things, and as she looked around the table at the experts who would facilitate this separation, she found herself struggling to maintain composure. It was Tom who spoke the words that needed to be said. His gruff voice cut through the clinical discussion with unexpected emotion. "What about the barn cats?" he asked. "Has anyone thought about how this will affect them?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and unanswerable. These domestic animals had invested themselves completely in protecting and nurturing a wild family. What would happen to them when that family disappeared into the forest? Elena had no scientific answer to offer. Animal grief was a subject that researchers were only beginning to understand, and the bonds formed in Margaret's barn were unprecedented. She could only acknowledge the concern and promise that monitoring would continue after the release, tracking not just the bobcats but the domestic cats who remained behind. The release site was chosen with careful consideration, a protected wilderness area about 15 miles from the farm, far enough to discourage return but similar enough in terrain to what Sierra had known before the fire destroyed her original territory. Frank and Elena would transport the family there at dawn, when the forests were quiet and the chances of human encounter were minimal. Margaret asked to accompany them, and after some discussion, her request was granted. The night before the release, Margaret made her final visit to the barn. She found the scene almost exactly as it had been on that first morning after the birth, Sierra lying in the hay with her kittens, surrounded by the protective circle of domestic cats. But everything had changed since then. The tiny newborns were now powerful young predators, their bodies rippling with muscle as they played and wrestled. Sierra herself had transformed from a desperate, starving refugee into a magnificent wild cat, her coat glossy and her eyes bright with renewed vitality. Margaret sat down in the hay a few feet away, ignoring the protests of her aging joints. Shadow approached and settled beside her, his familiar warmth a comfort against the cool night air. She stroked his black fur and whispered words of gratitude that seemed inadequate to the magnitude of what he and the others had done. "You saved her life," she told him. "You saved all their lives. Whatever happens tomorrow, that will never change." Sierra watched this exchange with calm attention, her yellow eyes meeting Margaret's in a moment of connection that transcended species. Then the wild mother did something that would stay with Margaret for the rest of her days. She rose from her nest and padded across the hay to where the old woman sat. She lowered her head and pressed her forehead briefly against Margaret's hand, a gesture of acknowledgement that needed no translation. Then she returned to her kittens, curling around them protectively as if nothing unusual had occurred. Margaret wept then, her tears falling silently into Shadow's black fur as the barn cats maintained their vigil one final time. Dawn broke soft and golden over the Vermont hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber that seemed almost too beautiful for such a sorrowful morning. Margaret had not slept, spending the night hours in the barn with her cats and their wild guests, memorizing every detail of a scene she knew she would never witness again. Tom arrived at 5 with coffee and quiet support, his presence a steady anchor against the emotional storm that threatened to overwhelm her. Elena and Frank came shortly after, their vehicles loaded with the transport carriers and equipment needed for the release. The process of separating Sierra and her kittens from the barn cats was more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Shadow refused to leave Sierra's side, his golden eyes fixed on the biologists with an expression that seemed to communicate both defiance and despair. Luna had to be physically removed from Hope's carrier, her white body struggling against Tom's gentle restraint as she yowled in protest. The other barn cats paced anxiously, their distress evident in every bristled hair and lashing tail. Sierra herself remained calm throughout the process, her wild dignity intact even as she was guided into the large carrier that would transport her to freedom. She touched noses briefly with Shadow through the wire mesh, a gesture that made Elena turn away to hide the tears that threatened her professional composure. The kittens were loaded next, their young voices calling to each other and to the domestic cats who had helped raise them. Hope was the last to be secured, her mismatched eyes so like Luna's seeking the white cat until the carrier door closed between them. The drive to the release site took nearly an hour, the vehicles moving slowly along winding forest roads that grew increasingly remote. Margaret sat in the back of Elena's SUV, her weathered hands clasped tightly in her lap as she watched the familiar landscape give way to wilderness she had never explored. Tom had stayed behind at the farm with the barn cats, understanding that this final chapter belonged to Margaret alone. The release site was everything Frank had promised. A clearing in old-growth forest, bordered by a stream that sang over smooth stones and surrounded by the dense undergrowth that bobcats preferred. The morning air was rich with the scents of pine and earth and growing things, a symphony of wild perfume that seemed to call to Sierra even before her carrier was opened. The release itself was anticlimactic in its simplicity. Frank positioned the carriers at the edge of the clearing and opened the doors, then retreated to give the animals space. Sierra emerged first, her powerful body low to the ground as she scanned her new territory with predatory attention. She moved in a slow circle, testing the air, reading the landscape with senses that humans could barely imagine. Then she turned back to the carriers and called to her kittens with a sound that was both command and invitation. One by one, the young bobcats emerged into their new world. They stayed close to their mother at first, overwhelmed by the vastness of the forest compared to the barn and enclosure they had known, but curiosity soon overcame caution, and they began to explore, their spotted bodies disappearing into the undergrowth before reappearing moments later to check that Sierra was still nearby. Hope was the last to leave her carrier, her small body hesitant in a way her siblings were not. She stood at the threshold between captivity and freedom, her eyes searching the clearing as if looking for something that was not there. Margaret watched with breaking heart, understanding what the young bobcat sought. Luna was not here. The white cat who had helped save her life, who had groomed her and slept beside her and loved her across the impossible divide between wild and domestic, was 15 miles away in a barn that Hope would never see again. Sierra returned to her smallest kitten and nudged her gently toward the forest. There was patience in the gesture, but also insistence, a mother's understanding that some separations were necessary for survival. Hope took one last look at the humans who had facilitated her journey into the world, and then she followed her mother and siblings into the green shadows of the forest. Within moments, they had vanished completely, swallowed by a wilderness that had always been their true home. Margaret stood in the clearing long after the bobcats had disappeared, her eyes fixed on the place where she had last seen them. Elena and Frank gave her space, busying themselves with equipment and pretending not to notice the tears that streamed down her weathered cheeks. When she finally turned away, her voice was steady despite her grief. "Thank you," she said to them. "Thank you for letting me be part of this." The drive back to the farm was quiet, each person lost in private reflection. Margaret found herself thinking about the nature of love and loss, about the connections that form between creatures who should have nothing in common. She thought about Shadow and Sierra, about Luna and Hope, about the miracle that had unfolded in her barn during the darkest days of winter. Whatever happened next, she had witnessed something that most people would never see. She had proof that compassion knew no species boundaries, that family could be chosen as well as born. Tom was waiting on the porch when they arrived, his face lined with concern that softened into relief when he saw her emerge from the vehicle. The barn cats were gathered around him, their bodies pressed together in a cluster of grief and confusion. Shadow sat apart from the others, his golden eyes fixed on the road as if waiting for someone who would never return. Margaret knelt beside the old black cat, her arthritic knees protesting the hard wooden porch. She stroked his fur and spoke words of comfort that she was not sure either of them believed. "They are free now," she told him. "They are safe and free, and that is because of you, because of all of you." Shadow leaned into her touch, his purr rumbling to life despite his sorrow. In the months that followed, wildlife cameras in the release area occasionally captured glimpses of a spotted family thriving in their new territory. Sierra taught her kittens well, and by autumn, they had dispersed to establish territories of their own. Hope was spotted several times near a farm on the edge of the wilderness, though she never approached the domestic cats that lived there. Some bonds, it seemed, could not be replaced. And in a weathered barn in rural Vermont, 6 domestic cats continued their vigil, waiting for a family that lived on in memory and in the wild legacy of one impossible winter night.